Welcome to The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining futures. My guest is Heather Davis, an assistant professor of culture and media at the New School in New York. In her recent book, Plastic Matter, that was published in 2022, she explores the transformation of geology, media, and bodies in light of plastic saturation. She's a member of the Synthetic Collective, an interdisciplinary team of scientists, humanities scholars, and artists who investigate and make visible plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. The book, which is rich, vivid, and so striking, takes us on a journey through plastic like none other. When I was thinking through the season, I knew I wanted to do an episode on plastic, and at that point I was thinking mainly of waste and pollution. And there are wonderful works on these issues, some of it which features in our conversation, and the rest identified and quoted in her book. But this book for me really sought out new territory and insights, which I'm so excited to share, and it connected so powerfully with our theme of Earth. From a material which is everywhere, which we treat as disposable, but simply will not go away, we find, as Davis put so powerfully in this book, the Earth always exceeds humans, even as humans in our creations are always thoroughly of the Earth. She writes elsewhere on plastic. It cannot simply be separated out, cleaved from other forms of materiality, nor does it easily reside only within the category of the synthetic, despite our desires for it to do so. I don't like to choose between my guests or their books. Whenever I have covered any of their books, it has changed my life in one way or the other. But I think in terms of being challenged to think about a material like plastic in strange, scary, and wonderful ways, this book for me was particularly impactful, like the material itself. Heather, it is such a pleasure to have you join us at the Subverse. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Great. So I want to speak to you today about your book, Plastic Matter. And it's a book that I've absolutely loved reading, I have to tell you. And in this book, you tell a story of how you grapple with your own inheritance. You speak about your grandfather at the beginning of the book. And you also talk about a world which is now plastic. Plastic is now everywhere, and it seems to transmit its daily banality outward. Through plastic's presence, you invite us to a broader re-evaluation of matter and material relations, especially under technocapitalism, where oil coats nearly every fabric of being. And here we have a paradox, which you outline in the book. We cannot escape plastic. It was designed as a protective barrier from the earth, and yet plastic cannot help but become part of the earth. Can you tell us more about all these extremely interesting ways of understanding plastic in your book?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for the kind words about the book. I'm glad that it resonated with you. And yeah, I came at this work from a couple of different angles, but one of them is from the fact of, growing up in relationship to my grandfather, who worked for DuPont for his entire life, mostly as an engineer and then later as a manager. And because of that, there was a relationship to plastic and to the inventions of plastic that were, I was going to say naturalized, but that's not exactly it. We're familiar, maybe. It's a better way of putting it. Familiar in the sense of filial, right? And also in the sense of there's a certain kind of comfort there. And I was very curious about the other sort of way into this project was through a conversation with a colleague years and years ago who was working on questions of steel. And I thought that his work was super interesting. I also found myself thinking this isn't really the material of the 20th century. And he was like, well, what is the material of the 20th century? And I immediately responded plastic. And he was like, okay, well, now you have to do that work. And so, 10 years later, I finally finished the book on this. And from my point of view, it really was this question of, there's the historical relationship of why is it that we ended up with so much plastic in the world, right? And that story is really about the kind of emergence of a particular kind of capitalism, a particular kind of consumer-based capitalism that is about disposability, that is about the massive expansion of markets, that's about massive expansion of products. And that, I think, is a super important story. And lots of people have been telling that, especially more recently. And I think it's a really important story because it gives us some tools about what to do about this problem. But I also wanted to ask after, what were some of the other reasons, or what are some of the other things that are happening in relationship to this massive expansion of plastics, right? In part because even if at this point we can have a kind of anti-capitalist critique or an anti-consumerist critique of the ways in which plastics have proliferated across the globe, we can't undo what has been done. And I think that especially with something like plastic, it really shows us this, right? So there's lots of, with the kind of vision of forests, et cetera, I mean, there's a kind of fantasy of renewal, although I think, soil biologists and forest ecologists might disagree with that. But I think that what plastic really attunes us to is the ways in which this massive proliferation of petrochemicals is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. And so my question was, okay, well, if this is the case, what are some of the other frameworks of thinking that have gone into this material, and how might we be able to approach this problem? And for me, a couple of the things that were deeply important was also this relationship to plasticity. And I was just also rereading Jeffrey Melke's really wonderful book on plastic and its cultural history. And he also points to this in the beginning of his book. He also points to this relationship between plastic and plasticity and a certain kind of fantasy of plasticity. So, I don't want to say that plasticity is bad under all circumstances, or that plasticity doesn't have some kind of really useful frameworks or really useful understandings of how it is that the humans work in the world. I was really influenced by a couple ways of thinking through plasticity. And one of them is through the incredible work of Zakiya Jackson, whose book really makes an incredibly important intervention into thinking about how the production of Blackened bodies under the regime of slavery wasn't necessarily only a project of the subhumanization of Black people, which I think is how it's often framed. I mean, I think if you look in Black feminist traditions, there's a lot of complexity there, but I think that's often how it's framed. And her intervention is really like, no, the project was really about plasticity. It was really about making people both superhuman and subhuman simultaneously. And I don't want to draw a direct parallel because I think there's, obvious political reasons why we might not want to do this, but this framework of thinking was deeply important and I think really helped to illuminate some things that I'd come up against in other places. For example, in Primo Levi's beautiful book on the periodic table, he says a couple really remarkable things in that book. And one of them is really about chemists like him, because that's what he was trained as, is what he did as his professional job, despite being so well known as a writer. That's actually what he was doing. He really describes his relationship to matter, to materiality, as this battle, and a battle to create the kind of form that we wanted out of it, right? And so I think for me, it's these two kind of lines of thinking came together to really try to think about, well, what is plastic doing in the world? And I should also say that this way of thinking is also really deeply indebted to Bernadette Bensaud-Vincent's really important work on chemistry and also on plastics, where this dream of plasticity, right, this dream of being able to manipulate matter at a molecular level, plastic was one of the first things that we could do this with. And this was part of my interest in the material. And we can see that this continues throughout the 20th and 21st century, right? We have been able to now manipulate matter at even smaller levels, right? Now we do things at the nanoscale instead of at the molecular scale. And obviously, again, there can be some real benefits to doing this, but I wanted to draw attention to some of the philosophical tendencies of the approach to the material conditions of the world that I think are both in line with a certain kind of racial capitalism that is emerging from a place like the United States, which is one of the largest manufacturers of plastics, both historically and in contemporary terms, and to really kind of like draw our attention to what are the ways in which this line of thinking is continuing, even if it's not only embedded in the material of plastic. Because I think that there's larger questions of a kind of ontological relationship or an onto-epistemological relationship to matter at stake here. And that's what I was really hoping to draw out in relationship to the kind of question of plastic and plasticity.
Thank you so much, Heather. And you use a term in your book, which I found so fascinating, which is synthetic universality. But you also speak about plastic pollution and waste colonialism. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about this.
Yeah. So there's lots of folks who've been doing amazing work on waste colonialism. Waste colonialism is, Max LeBron writes a lot about waste colonialism and their really important work. Usually it's thought about in relationship to the trade and dumping of waste, usually from, so-called developed nations to so-called underdeveloped nations, or to the global south, right? So from the global north to the global south. And obviously, what's actually really interesting in a particular moment in time is that there's been a lot of resistance to this in the last 5 to 7 years. So, starting with China saying that they were no longer going to take any waste from North America or from the EU. They were no longer going to be an importer of plastic waste. And that had huge ripple effects across the globe, including that was sort of the impulse for the EU to start to actually think about how they're going to get to a kind of zero waste future. And I don't think that without the refusal of China to import that waste products that we would have gotten there. And this also happens internally too, right? Like I was talking to my students about this in class a couple days ago, and one of the things that they were pointing out is that even within a place like the United States, New York ships its waste down to Virginia and to other parts of the country that are poorer, right? This happens on a global scale, but it also happens on a more national scale where the waste of the wealthy is being shipped to regions that are poorer. And this is obviously super important for questions of justice, for questions of exposure to toxicity, for questions of how do we think through the relations that we've built, right? So I think that one of the things that this helps us to see is that if you're looking at the kind of question of profitability in relationship to plastics, it really helps us to analyze a certain understanding of what capitalism is and how it functions at this moment in time. If you look at questions of waste and its distribution, what it allows you to see is more the functions of colonialism or imperialism or a kind of internal colonialism, whatever we might want to call that, right? So it allows us to see sort of different kinds of power dynamics at play. And in relationship to synthetic universality, what I was really trying to come up with there was like a way to describe the fact that for me, one of the things that's super important about plastic as a material was really about the way in which it lends itself to containers and to containerization, right? So it lends itself to a certain kind of fantasy of containment. And, we can see this through all of the ways in which it gets used in the world. It's often used as a kind of barrier or shield, everything from those kinds of like plexiglass surfaces that are at buffets, like food buffets or something. Or, during COVID, this became incredibly apparent, which with the ways in which plastic started becoming even more ubiquitous or even more visible as a kind of sealant or barrier for health reasons. But what was actually interesting about that was that often those interventions were not actually beneficial to slowing or stopping the spread of the virus. Sometimes they actually made it worse. But there's a fantasy around that, right? That plastic sells itself as this, right? Plastic sells itself as the way in which we can have cleaner access to food, cleaner access to environments, that we can live in a kind of sealed space. And in addition to this, there's something about, despite the fact that plastics are so many different things and the potential threats of different forms of plastics are vastly different, right? Like we know that PVC and styrene-based plastics are just really bad for human health. And there's been some serious campaigns to try to, at least within the United States, to try to just declare the vinyl monomer a hazardous material and to get it banned. And there's very good reasons for doing this, as opposed to something like PET, which is a much more kind of like benign material. But all of these materials have a kind of dream, in addition to this kind of dream of being able to seal things off or create a kind of perfected container. There's also a way in which they're produced in such a way that it gives us a sense of their endless replicability. If they kind of emerge from nowhere and they just kind of like massively proliferate across the globe in a kind of way that feels as if it's the same, even if sometimes it's really not. But we encounter it in this way where we expect a certain kind of standardization from consumer products, right? And so I was trying to describe what that was. I decided to call it synthetic universality because of the ways in which, like, when there's, kind of local movements for materials or for foods or something like that, if you said, oh, well, I only work with local plastics, or I only buy local plastics, or I only consume local plastics, it seems kind of absurd, right? Like, what on earth does that mean? Like, you went and got the oil out of the ground yourself, you cracked ethylene, and then you produce. It doesn't make any sense. So there's a way in which it just becomes such an abstracted material so quickly, or really from the outset, that I wanted to think about that as a certain kind of universality, right? Like a universality in line with the mechanisms of colonialism.
Heather, I love it when in your book you actually talk about this plastic sort of just blowing in the wind. And I think that's a great metaphor. It's just battered out of place, as you put it.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, it's both like blowing in the wind and then just kind of like emerging from nowhere, like as if it's become a fourth realm, a fourth kingdom of materials, right? Like in addition to, although I think maybe we already have a fourth material, like isn't it the archaea or whatever, the bacterial world? Anyway, fifth maybe.
What you call it in your book, the arch material.
Yes, exactly. And so it's just like a way to really try to think through, like, how do we describe, but I wanted to point out that it was synthetic, like that it doesn't have to be this way, or it didn't have to develop this way, or the kinds of relationships that we have built with this set of materials weren't inevitable, right? And so it's a kind of question of trying to draw the relationship between plastics and the petrochemical industry more broadly, and its relationships to capitalist colonial structures.
I wanted to follow up on this paradox. So you have plastic, which is supposed to be a sealant or a barrier. And now it's in us, it's in our bodies, it's in our oceans, it's in the ground, it's everywhere. Clearly, it didn't really work as a sealant or as a barrier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like that's one of the most fascinating parts of it for me, but like that, it didn't just fail, it failed so spectacularly at that, right? It's like, even unlike other contaminants in the world, like heavy metals, those things are easier to recover despite their health hazards, or, the problems associated with them. There is a way in which you can recover them with particular procedures that becomes incredibly difficult when you're talking about plastics and its associated petrochemicals. So, in part because, as you're pointing out, not only do we have microplastics now, but we also have nanoplastics, which have now been proved to cross cellular barriers. They can cross the blood-brain barrier, for example. And so these molecules are in our bodies, not just as something tangible that we can see, but really kind of constituting our very being. And what they're doing there, like whether or not this is cause for major concern or if it's relatively benign, I think at this point we actually just have very little understanding. There's clearly some things that are definitely health hazards, right? We know that phthalates are health hazards. We know that PFAS are health hazards. We know that vinyl monomers are health hazards. We know about all of that. But I think that there's still a lot of research to be done. And in part because despite the fact that maybe it seems obvious in retrospect that, of course, these materials were going to break down and get smaller and smaller, and because of their chemical makeup, they don't decompose and therefore turn into something else. They just get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and therefore can get into everything. That there wasn't a lot of foresight about this. There wasn't a lot of study to figure out what on earth that would do. And I think also what this really helps us to reveal is the things that, so many people from so many parts of the world have been saying for, millennia, or maybe forever, about the kind of interconnectedness of life, right? About the interconnectedness of our fundamental being. I think it's really just coming from a particular understanding of Western materiality that we have this sense that we somehow could have cut ourselves off to begin with, right? That is possible. And from that Western tradition, there's a lot of feminist scholars, including Stacey Alimo, who's really done a lot of important work around thinking about notion like transcorporeality. So thinking about the ways in which the body is always open to the outside, right? But I think that, and fundamentally open to the outside, that we are fundamentally not containable beings. Within a Western tradition, we think of ourselves that way, right? We think of ourselves as discrete subjects, as individuals, as beings that do have the skin somehow operates as a real barrier between ourselves and the outside world. And of course, there's a mechanism of negotiation there, right? Like, I mean, somebody like Hannah Landecker would talk about that in terms of metabolization. So what is being let in and what is not, right? There's a negotiation of the body through the immune system, through the skin, through other kinds of mechanisms. But to me, plastic really reveals the ways in which we are so fundamentally open to the world around us. And I think that if we took that really seriously, it seems like it would be a really good argument for not polluting in the way that we do, right? Because I think that, pollution in the ways that we've seen it in the 20th and 21st centuries, you can only do that if you really think that it's possible both to seal yourself off and that there's another place for that pollution to go to. And once those two things start to get disrupted, either through political mechanisms or through kind of physical mechanisms, I think it really forces us to reevaluate our relationship to what we're making in the world and hopefully to make things that are not as hazardous.
We'll be back after a break. Here I had a question, which is, you also speak about plastic being in the layers of the earth. And I found that section also really interesting.
Yeah, so that comes out of a lot of the work that Kelly Jasbach and Patricia Corcoran have done. And along with Captain Charles Moore, they're the three people to name or to give a name to what was already being seen as a phenomenon across the globe, and in particular in Hawaii, which is that there's these rocks that are being formed through processes of usually campfires on beaches where there's so much plastic on these beaches that anytime there's any kind of fire or anything like this, it forms into a rock-like substance, which is a kind of conglomerate of different kinds of debris and also the mostly lava-based rocks that are there. And to me, what was really interesting about this was that I think that we like to try to make a clean distinction between so-called man-made materials and so-called natural materials, right? And something like the plastic agglomerate completely undoes this, right? And in part, not only because it's a kind of merging of these worlds, but like after they're merged, there's the question of like, okay, well, then what happens, right? Like, does this become a home for other, for birds or for turtles or for some other creature, right? Like, does some other creature come along and nibble on these conglomerates? Like, there's entire way in which plastic, even though it's formed in these relationships of trying to aspire to particular kinds of Western ideals of matter and materiality, kind of immediately falls apart in reality in the kind of real world where it inevitably gets folded back into the earth, right? I don't say this as like a way of like being like, oh, it doesn't matter what humans do. It doesn't matter what political economy systems do. The earth will always take care of it, right? Like, I don't mean it that way, but this isn't like a justification for widespread pollution. But I do think that there's a fundamentally important philosophical lesson there. Just as we can't imagine our bodies to be these kind of perfectly sealed containers, we also can't imagine, or rather we can imagine that, but it leads to all these like really horrible consequences. That similarly with the earth, it's like no matter what we make, it's always of the earth. We'll always return to the earth. There is a fundamental way in which we are just of the earth, and all of our inventions are of the earth. And I think that there's something super important about that in terms of thinking beyond a kind of anthropocentric framework. And also to really ask after, okay, well, if that's the fundamental relationship of where we find ourselves, then what are our sense of obligations to take care of not just ourselves, but all of the beings that we live with, right? Including, rocks and water and, like these other things that we might think of as not alive, right? So I think it fundamentally disrupts this kind of clean separation between culture and nature that has been erected through Western philosophy in the last, depending on how you want to date that, for the last few hundred years. I'll put it that way, at least.
I think this leads well to the next set of questions I want to ask you, which is that in your book, you write of how plastic haunts particular bodies and geographic regions. You also speak about how plastic subtends mass and digital media. Can you tell us more about these hauntings and how plastic is not just a logistical medium, but also a medium that communicates between the living and the dead and the living and the non living?
Yes, totally. Um, yeah, I mean, I was really interested in the ways in which some of the early plastics, like celluloid, were obviously used almost immediately for film. So, for photography, for motion pictures,
So called.
and of course digital media, despite the fact that we think of it as immaterial and all this stuff, and lots of people have done really great work on the rare earth minerals and things like that are embedded in our computers and our digital networks, are also heavily invested in plastics. The plastics coat the undersea cables that allow us to speak to each other right now. There's tons of plastics in our headphones and our computers, all of this stuff. But I was really interested in the ways in which part of what those mediums do is that they allow us to see into the past and to literally see people who are no longer with us. And then I was thinking about the ways in which, thinking with somebody, my colleague Zoe Todd, who really thinks about plastic and oil in relationship to undead relationship. So the ways in which that oil, because it's the compression of mostly plants from millennia ago, that it's sort of being brought back to life in this unconsensual manner, right? Like those bodies are being dug up and burned and kind of massively proliferating. And so I was thinking about the kind of conflation of these two things, about the ways in which celluloid and other kinds of media allow us the access to the past, to voices and images of people who are no longer living. And at the same time, there's this other layer of being able to look much, much further into the past, to mostly these plant beings that are also no longer living, right? But there's a way in which both of these things are continuing to be animated. In the one through, the burning of fossil fuels and the use of petrochemicals, and then the other one through the kind of animated qualities of contemporary media. And so I was thinking about that and the ways in which, particularly in places like Rochester, New York, which is the home of the Kodak factory for many, many years, until Kodak kind of failed to make the switch to digital and then collapsed as a company. But in that part of the world, there's massive chemical contamination, in part because of the production of different kinds of films that are used in photography and then in the development of photographs. So I was thinking about how in that part of the world, there's like these increased cancer rates. And one of my other colleagues, Courtney Desiree Morris, has been doing a really important work where she's writing a book on her ancestors who come from Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and documenting what life looks like there. And in particular, she's from a community called Mossville, or her family is from a community called Mossville, where in that community, which had been a site of real Black refuge for centuries, since the 1700s, people became completely displaced through the expansion of the petrochemical industry. And I was really interested in this kind of like multiple hauntings, right? So the multiple hauntings of the afterlife of slavery, the multiple hauntings of settler colonialism, the hauntings of both people who are no longer living, but who are reanimated in film and in video and through audio recordings as well. And also the kind of hauntings of the sets of materials that are coming up unconsensually from the ground from millennia ago. And so I was interested in using haunting as a way to describe that kind of environmental violence. And for me, there was something important about that framing because of the ways in which I think it allows us to see the animated quality of environmental violence, where it's not just a kind of blunt force, which of course it is, but it's not only that, but that there's like a kind of productivity there, right? And also that people can do different things in relationship to mediums, right? Like one of the things that I found in terms of Morris's photographic work so powerful was the way in which through this, she's allowing her ancestors to speak again. So they might have been displaced from the region physically, right? Because most people have been, but there's a way in which they refuse to leave. And I think that there's something really important about that, right? That in this kind of artistic practice, it allows her to show us as an audience the ways in which there's this Black feminist refusal that is like very much at the heart of practice of haunting, where, you know, you can almost imagine the CEOs of these petrochemical companies being haunted by all these people who they've displaced or harmed along the way, right? And I think there's something really powerful about invoking that kind of figure of ghosts and haunting to try to draw attention to some of these larger questions.
Wonderful. In fact, two things in that chapter, you used a very powerful sentence where you talked about how contemporary culture is saturated in oil. And then you go on to say that, in other words, when engaging in oil media, we need to make our words, our images count.
Yeah, I mean, that really came from, that's actually something from this beautiful photographer, Kelly Wood, who I work with in a collective, along with Patricia and and Kelly Jasbach. We work together as part of the synthetic collective where we look at plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. And Kirsty Robertson is really important in that collection, has been also a real important thinker for me in thinking about what plastic is. And together we do some scientific studies, but we also put on exhibitions. And I think that, you know, for those of us who work in the cultural industries, like for artists and for curators and for arts writers, there's a question of like, okay, if we know that all of this material is deeply engaged in oil, like what do we do about that, right? Like there's one solution where you can say, oh, well, I'll only work with pre-existing materials. So I'll only work with materials that are being reused. And I think that's a great solution for certain artists. And I think it's a really interesting kind of constraint for artists too, right? But I think that there's also something to be said for like, yeah, sometimes it's really important to make something new, especially in the cultural sphere. I think it's important to produce particular kinds of images or to produce particular kinds of words. But I think the question is like, okay, yeah, if you're going to do it, if you're going to put in all that energy, if you're going to expend all of those resources, like really make sure that you're doing it for good reasons, right? Like, and really try to make it reverberate as much as possible. Also, it's like an invitation for people to acknowledge how much power we have, right? Like, even if sometimes we feel powerless in the face of these corporations, it's like, no, I think if through collective effort, it's been shown time and time again that things can really change. So I think it's both like an invitation to embody that power and also to like a reminder to be like, well, you know, if you're going to really do something, like, yeah, make it count. Yeah.
Heather, you talked about the haunting of CEOs. I like that image. And in the book, it would be different if it's an American film and different if it's a Japanese film.
Yeah, that is actually from Eve Tuck and C. Ree. They wrote this incredibly beautiful article about haunting where they analyze American films and analyze Japanese horror films. And what they said, you know, like, I mean, I'm not as big of a horror fan as they are, so I'm just going to trust them on this. But they said that what's super interesting about these two different like national takes on the genre of the horror film is that in an American context, often there's a way to assuage the ghost or like the specter or whoever it is that's like haunting you. Like as long as you do the right thing, eventually the ghost will go away. And this often has to do with questions of like, you know, you're not supposed to do anything bad. Like you shouldn't have sex or you shouldn't do drugs or like, you know, you have to be very pure, right? And as long as you're pure and good and you do the right things, eventually the ghost will go away. And they were noticing that in Japanese films, this is not at all the case. that the ghost often doesn't go away, right? Like the ghost instead just kind of gets passed on from one person to another, right? There's a kind of sense of perpetual haunting. They make this relationship to settler colonialism there, right? Like they talk about how settler colonialism actually operates more like the Japanese horror film, where it's just a matter of it being passed on. But within the kind of imaginary of settlers, there's always this imaginary where it's like, oh, if I am just a good, virtuous, moral subject, I don't have to be accountable for all of the horrors that I participate in on a daily basis, right? They're trying to say, like, we need to just grapple with that. Like, we don't have to become overwhelmed by it, or we don't have to not act because of it, but it needs to be acknowledged, right? It needs to be acknowledged. Like, those ghosts are demanding our attention. I've definitely had debates with friends about like this article, and some people find it very depressing. And I can understand why, but I think it's actually quite beautiful, because I think it's showing us a way to be okay. Like, we live in this world where there's so much violence and so much historical violence and contemporary violence, and we are caught up in these chains that we have some control over, but not, obviously our control is limited, right? And I think that there's something really important about like just sitting with some of that and to not try to run away from it. It feels as if like much of the problems that come out of Western society, or from settler colonial societies in particular, it's about this knee-jerk reaction to appeasement, or knee-jerk reaction to immediately turning away from something hard or difficult. And what I like about this is that it's like, oh no, that ghost is going to follow you, or it's going to follow your friends, like kind of almost no matter what you do, right? So you might as well learn to figure out a way to live with that, right? And I think that there's something, yeah, I think that there's something beautiful, like really, really profound about that.
Thank you so much, Heather. And now I'd love to move to the next set of questions, which is, in your book, you write that plastic is contributing to non reproductivity while birthing a future of strange new bacterial life forms adapted to deal with these chemical environments. Can you lead us through these transitions and different ways of thinking about futures, no futures, afterlives, alter lives, as you discuss it in your book?
Sure. I think this was like some of the first writing I did on plastic was around this issue, because it really captured my imagination, which is that there are all of these different types of organisms that are developing to be able to eat plastics. So mostly different forms of bacteria and also some mycelium. And then in addition to this, there's also a lot of organisms now. There's like some really interesting research being done on how there's now new ecosystems that are being formed around plastic waste. So, you'll find out in the middle of the ocean species of fish that normally only live by the shore. And the question there then becomes like, okay, do we want to have like a pure nature that looks like the world before the mass proliferation of plastic? Or is there a way to acknowledge that despite the kind of polluting harms of plastic, it's producing new life forms? How do we negotiate that, right? And there's a real tension there that I think is not easily resolvable. But one of the ways in which I try to trace it is to say, because in addition to these kinds of new forms of life or new ways of living that are emerging because of massive plastic pollution, there's also simultaneously, as you were saying, that lots of the chemicals that are associated with plastics, specifically the phthalate categories of plastics, but also some of the PFAS plastics are leading, or PFAS chemicals are leading to increased infertility. So specifically male infertility. I don't think that human populations are about totally just completely crash because of chemical saturation. I don't think it's at all like that. But I do think that there's something that we have to grapple with in relationship to this. So even if there's no kind of like immediate threat to worldwide populations, I think that it's almost like plastic is asking us these questions, right? And some of the questions have to do with questions of reproduction. And so for me, like as a queer person living in the world, and also somebody who's really been invested in queer theory for my whole adult life, for queer folks, this, relationship to having biological children, that is not the signifier of a good life, right? I mean, this was something that was really difficult for queer people for a very long time. And not to say that queer people were infertile or something like that, but rather that there was like all these like state mechanisms where, you know, if you were queer and you had children, there's like the threat of you being understood as inherently a bad parent and your kids being taken away. Or there's also a way in which, because of the function of queerness and the kind of non-reproductive sex that queer people have, there's always been a threat there in terms of the kind of colonial order, right? And because of that, you know, queer people have developed really robust and intricate and beautiful systems of kinship making that go beyond the nuclear family, beyond mostly out of necessity, because so many queer folks, even now, are rejected by their families of origin and then have to make new family in the world, right? And because of that, there's like a way in which I think that we understand how to do that, that there's like these networks of these broad historical and contemporary networks of how to think about kinship in more open and fluid ways beyond the kind of frameworks of the biological family. And from there, I think that what for me is most interesting is that like within queer theory, there's a real turn to the ecological. And I think that in part it's because there's a capacity for being able to understand that our obligations and our sense of responsibilities can extend beyond those who you are related to. And therefore it's not so much of a leap then to go from, oh, I'm not at all related to this person, but I consider them my family, to thinking about non-humans in that way as well, right? And it's like, and just like with other family relations, that doesn't mean that it's easy, right? It doesn't mean that you get along. It doesn't mean that there aren't fights. You know, like, I mean, queer communities are notoriously messy, right? There's like notorious, all kinds of drama, right? So it's not like this is some easy process where everyone's just like, oh, great, now we're one big happy family. It's like, that's not how families function. But there is a sense of like, you're going to show up for that person if they need you, right? Like, even if you got into some massive fight the day before. I think that there's a way in which we can extend that out to thinking about ecological relations. And in particular, what I was really fascinated with is like, okay, if these new forms of life that are being created are because of the massive proliferation of plastics, then what does somebody like myself, who has this kind of direct familial relationship to the plastics industry, what is my responsibility to these new kinds of organisms, right? They're not my children, right? But we can think of them as a kind of non-human filial progeny. And that, to me, I think is an interesting provocation to think about how to go about grappling with the complexities of thinking through both, on the one hand, that doesn't stop us from having direct political action in terms of slowing down plastics production or getting rid of the particularly harmful plastics. But it does, I think, also force us to look at the world as it is and to think about how to live better in the world that we actually are a part of, not just an imaginary world.
Exactly. In your book, you write, find ways of embracing the inevitable emergence of multiple strange and beautiful life forms while holding chemical companies to account, to do both at the same time. And the other thing that really struck me is the stroke of the child, so predominant in modern environmentalism and even in environmental law.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, exactly.
Because I was a lawyer previously, and whenever people talk about intergenerational legal theory, it's always with the trope of the child.
Yeah, exactly. That's fascinating. I would love to hear more about that from your end. You know, as you would know, right? Probably better than I would, that this kind of trope of the child is always there, but it's always like a perfect child, right? Like, this isn't like a delinquent child, right? Like, this isn't the child that's like constantly getting in trouble or is like constantly causing disruptions. This isn't that child, right? This is a child that is going to be the embodiment of, you know, the continuation of capitalism and colonialism as we know it, right? And in the West, this is obviously often associated with like, you know, like a white, straight male child, right? Who's like very, you know, beautiful and like who's completely able-bodied. You know, that child literally is on the covers of all kinds of magazines as a kind of appeal to why we need to, quote unquote, save the planet. And yeah, coming from this whole strand of queer theory, there's a real resistance to that child. And there's resistance to that child not because of a resistance to children, right? There's a difference between actually existing children in the world, who clearly we have some responsibility towards, and to their, to the continuation of, their children and their children's children, et cetera, right? This kind of intergenerational responsibility that you're talking about. And at the same time, there's a way in which that figure of the child is often an argument for why things need to stay the same, or why things need to continue to expand and grow in a kind of capitalist framework, right? Like the fact that, like if your child has less than what you grew up with, this is considered some kind of travesty, right? Like that there's always this like hope of capitalist betterment, of economic betterment. And of course, people shouldn't have to live in desperate poverty. I'm not trying to advocate for that. But I think that this trope of economic betterment through the generations is like, well, that is the expansion and the accumulation of particular kinds of resources that is just fundamentally impossible if you think about that in relationship to the actual finite, things like clean water and clean air and access to minerals and fossil fuels on this planet. So I think that what queer theorists would say is that they don't want a future. They don't want children. And not because they don't want a future or they don't want children, but they want a fundamental disruption to the social order as it is. The figure of the child as the continuation of the social order needs to be fundamentally disrupted.
Thank you so much, Heather. So we are now done with my set of questions, but I would like to give you the final word. If there's something that you think we've missed in the conversation that you'd like to highlight, or maybe just something you'd like to tell us about how your book was received and something that you now may kind of think about differently or may want to kind of add onto your book.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that has been exciting about putting the book out into the world is that I've had some very unexpected responses, including maybe my most favorite response was from a worker who works in a plastics factory, who I'm now doing a collaboration with, and really like shifting my attention to production. So I think like that has been really wonderful, because I also received some really generous, I'll put it this way, really generous criticism that the book does lots of really great things, but that it could be a bit more grounded. And so I'm really excited about like taking this kind of theoretical framework that I've built and thinking about how that fits or doesn't fit with actually looking at production cycles of plastics. And I think that it's a really interesting way in which maybe theory intervenes in the world in ways that are very unexpected.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and talk with you.
Well, thank you so much for your interest. I really appreciate it, and your generosity in reading the book and being so attentive to the work.
Thanks to Heather Davis for sharing her thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.